Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Adams Memorial Foundation Book Club. I'm Jackie Cushman, President of the Adams Memorial Foundation and Chair of the Adams Memorial Commission. Thank you for joining us tonight with our conversation with author and litigator Tim Sandeur. We are so excited to have him on. His book, which we're going to talk about tonight, is really it's impressive. It covers an amazing amount of territory. I would suggest it for anyone who's not just interested in our independence, but also what led to it and why it happened and what it means for us today. He's really done an outstanding job. Mr. Sandeur is the Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Goldwater Institute's Sharp Norton Center for Constitutional Litigation and holds the Duncan Chair in Constitutional Government. He has litigated many cases promoting economic liberty, private property rights, free speech, and other individual rights. He is often author of 9 books and over 50 scholar articles on subjects ranging from copyright to Civil War to Star Trek. Of course, always fun. He has taught at 4 universities and is an adjunct scholar with the Cato Institute. In proclaiming liberty, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and the Declaration of Independence, he revisits the American Revolution through the minds of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Obviously, that's why we love this book. Through an impressive combination of legal historiography, historical narrative, and political philosophical dialogue, he argues that the ideals behind the American Revolution were indeed revolutionary. It wasn't just a revolution in terms of the war, it was a revolution in terms of the ideals and the beliefs that led to it. He believes that our founding fathers believed in personal rights and the rights from God were not only genuine but necessary for the success of our nation. We are so excited to have him join us today. I'm going to give you a brief update on where we were in the memorial. So as you know, we have H.R. 2306, which is a bill introduced to the House of Representatives by Congressman John Molinar. It passed Congress last year at the very end of the year in December. It is now in the Senate, and it has been considered in a subcommittee in the Senate last week, which is great news. So it's making progress. We are awaiting a business meeting for that particular subcommittee. Hopefully it'll be in the near term and they'll be able to move out of the Senate, but we are making progress. We're very grateful for everyone who's helped us on this journey, and we look forward to having that legislation done so we can continue with this memorial program. Just a few housekeeping notes. This is a webinar, so everyone is muted right now. We will take questions. If you just want to type them into the question box, then we'll be glad to make sure that we answer that. Also, this is being recorded and it will be available via YouTube later on this week. So now to the fun part, the author talk. So thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. And I just want to start with, this is really, as I mentioned to you beforehand, this is an amazing book. It goes back and looks at not only English history, but it goes back to the Romans and to the Greeks. I mean, you cover so much information in this book. So tell me, how did you even think about trying to put all this into one book, and how long did it take?
Well, I guess the answer to that second question is it took all my life, because I've been interested in the Declaration and the American Revolution and the ideas of the Founding Fathers for pretty much all my life. And so, in a sense, I've been sort of storing things away for this opportunity for many years. And when I got the assignment to write the book, I knew there were a number of things I wanted to do. I wanted to go through the Declaration clause by clause and explain what each of the grievances specifically is referring to, because I think that's something that a lot of Americans aren't really familiar with, the exact specific things that all of those, some of them are written in really broad terms, right? Like the king has denied his approval of laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Like, what does that refer to? And so I wanted to go through that. I also wanted to talk about the philosophical element of the Declaration, what it means to say all men are created equal with inalienable rights and so forth. That these are in fact true. These are not just, our tradition versus somebody else's tradition, but it is in fact the truth that people are born equal and born free. I also wanted to talk about where those ideas came from, and particularly the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution of the 17th century in England, which are incidents that a lot of Americans don't know about and that were profoundly influential on what happened 100 years later with the American Revolution. So I wanted to talk about that, but I also did not want the book to be just a dry treatise on political philosophy or something boring like that. So I wanted to tell it in a narrative form through the friendship of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams leading up to the Revolution. And I will confess something at the outset. I shouldn't tell this to the Adams Memorial people, but I'm a Jefferson guy. Been a Jefferson guy all my life. And so I knew a lot about Jefferson and I knew some about John Adams before I started working on the book. And I learned a lot about John Adams in working on the book. And I came to love him. I mean, Jefferson once wrote a letter to James Madison, who, by the way, hated Adams, saying, if you ever get to know him, you'll love him. And he's right about that. I got to know John Adams and really fell in love with the guy. He's just a fascinating figure and one of the great titans in the history of liberty.
That is so interesting because I always say, now I've been involved with this project for a little over 2 years. And I knew, to your point, like I knew about Adams. I know who he is. I know kind of, know where he fit into the whole narrative, but I didn't know him that well because he's not a very well-known figure. He's not nearly as well known as Jefferson. I knew more about Jefferson. I knew more about Washington, who is the father of our nation. But the interesting thing about Jefferson and Abigail is, and John Quincy, quite frankly, the more I get to know them, the more I like them.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're interesting people. They're real people. Because they did keep all the diaries and they had the letters from one another that he's pouring out his heart and he's pouring out his thoughts. They come across to me as they're not perfect, but I mean, there are no perfect people, right? There are a lot. I mean, none of us are perfect. And so to me, to have that kind of vulnerability and to really see inside how they were thinking and how much they really sacrificed to create our nation. I mean, it was a family effort. Abigail was just as involved. She's the one that supported John and made sure he could go and serve our country. But I'm kind of like you. The more I get to know them, the more I actually like them. They're actually a really, really great family.
And in one respect, Jefferson and Adams are very, very different people in the sense that Adams is very candid. He's very frank and he's very self-revelatory, right? He keeps a diary virtually his whole life. He tells you what he thinks and really makes no bones about it. Jefferson, on the other hand, is much more reserved, much more reticent, and he would never keep a diary, absolutely never. He writes letters instead. But in these letters, and he writes tens of thousands of letters in his lifetime, in these letters, they're always very carefully composed, and they're almost never truly self-revelatory in any way. They're written. Jefferson always writes with the feeling that the biographers are looking over his shoulder, and that's something John Adams never does. And it's kind of funny when you read the famous retirement letters when they, from 1811 or so till their deaths, they're very famous for rekindling their friendship and everything. Well, actually, if you look at those letters closely, what's funny about them is John keeps trying to bait Jefferson into being, candid. And he's like, you and I ought not to die before we've explained ourselves to each other. And Jefferson always responds with sort of his poetry of, I steer my bark with hope ahead and fear astern. It's like Jefferson would never descend to the level of the barroom conversation, whereas John Adams does. And, part of this, I think, is John Adams was a trial lawyer, and Thomas Jefferson is an appellate lawyer. So John Adams wants to get in front of the jury and argue a case, and Thomas Jefferson wants to go to the law library and look things up.
Yeah, he wants to appeal by reason, not necessarily by emotion.
Right. And so they kind of strengthen each other. They reinforce each other's weak spots. They're kind of a yin and yang.
Oh, absolutely. We already have an audience question, which I think is perfect for where you are. So as you were learning about John Adams, what was that made you like him, and how did he win you over? So maybe it was that kind of candor, but what is it for you?
It's actually, I admire tremendously how hard John Adams worked for American liberty. He was almost a decade older than Jefferson, so he was around during the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, for example. Jefferson's still in school at that time. He's too young to participate in those things. He was the second youngest member of the Continental Congress. He's really a newcomer to the debate at the time he writes the Declaration of Independence. Whereas John Adams had been in the trenches on this stuff for a very long time, and a lot of it is stuff like that we don't read about today. Like I tell the story in the book about John Adams defending sailors who were being impressed, that is, forced to serve in the Royal Navy against their will, and, as Adams rightly argued, against the law. And, Jefferson did do some of that kind of work. He defended people who were accused of being slaves. Jefferson argued against that, saying that they weren't, in about a half a dozen of what are called freedom cases when he was a young lawyer. So Jefferson did this too. But I came to really admire Adams's commitment and his overall belief in the rule of law. And his belief that the rule of law was itself a revolutionary doctrine that would change the world. Adams gets this reputation nowadays of being sort of the conservative and Jefferson is the liberal, and I think that's wildly exaggerated. Adams was a revolutionary and was every bit as committed to overturning the basic, long-standing traditions of his society, if necessary, to serve the doctrines of liberty. In 1776, he was as committed to that as any French revolutionary. He was a radical man, and just to say that he was a conservative, that the conservatism came later, I think, which is, by the way, one reason why I think that Jefferson and Adams had their rupture later in life. Fortunately, I didn't have to talk about that in the book, because I end the book before I get to their disagreements.
That is part of the planning on the book, right? Figuring out what scope you're going to actually
right
in the process, because you can't include everything.
Yeah.
And I do, so back to your point earlier about how, the more you learned about him, the more you liked him. David McCullough, who was a huge champion, obviously he wrote the book, right, on John Adams, turned into the miniseries. And he was a huge advocate for this project way before I got involved 25 years ago, and often talked about how horrible it was that, we didn't have a memorial to John Adams. I mean, he was, very much to your point, like he was a hard worker. He very much was committed to this country, and we in no way recognize him. But he actually started that project. You may already know this, but he started that project as a book about Jefferson and Adams. And then when he got into the research, he decided he likes Adams more, so he made it about John Adams.
That's funny. That does kind of parallel my experience, because when I first set out on writing my book, my original plan was to write about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. But you can't really you can't do that, because he was so young at the time and so new to politics in 1776 that you can't really write that book. You can't tell that story without John Adams. And, this, of course, is something Adams was sensitive about later in life. When Jefferson's getting all the credit for writing the Declaration, this is
right.
about 1800 or so, Adams says, well, I wrote the preamble to the resolution calling on the colonies to write new state constitutions, and that was the equivalent of a Declaration of Independence. And he's right about that. It's something that he does deserve a lot of credit for. But, this is how history is sometimes. It's very fickle sometimes.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about your process. How long you said all your life, but obviously you didn't, you drew on your entire life, but you had, I'm sure, a start and an end date. And I would also like to know about your research process. And then how did you weave all of these sources together and make it, to your point, very easy to read?
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. My model in this and in my previous book called Freedom's Furies, which is about the lives of Ayn Rand, Isabel Patterson, and Rose Wilder Lane, the three women who basically started the modern libertarian movement in the United States. In both cases, my model was a marvelous book that I admire tremendously called The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand, which won the Pulitzer Prize about 25 years ago. And what I loved about Menand's book is the way that he tells the story of the development of ideas through the narrative of these friends who knew each other and worked together. And I think it's a very compelling way of telling a story. And so that was my rough model to follow. It took me about a year to write the book. I was asked in September of 24 to write the book and have it done by September 25 so we could get it out in time for the 250th anniversary. And as far as my method, I tend to jump into things. And so I just immediately started writing, because that's a pretty short deadline for a
very short deadline, yeah.
And so I just jumped in and then worked on the research while I was writing it. So I got, Adams's diary and letters and things, and I was reading them in the morning and working during the day. I'm very fortunate that my employers allowed me the time necessary to work on the book. And, fortunately, there are so many resources available on the internet nowadays. When I started working as a writer, which I would say was about 25 years ago, it was amazing how much has improved since then in terms of looking stuff up, and not just looking stuff up, but getting images of the original documents. You can get pictures of the original documents that George III himself wrote by hand and things like that. And all of the writings of Adams and Jefferson are more or less available online at this point. So, it takes a lot of research to find these documents, but it's way more convenient than it has ever been in the history of scholarship. And I'm really fortunate to have that benefit. And I also had a lot of teachers through my life who guided me in the right direction in some of these things. I dedicate the book to two of them, Harry Jaffa and Roger Pilon of the Cato Institute, and both of whom were mentors to me when I was just starting out on this road, and I think really steered me the right way for finding this kind of information. And one other, I should throw in another shout out, and that is to John Philip Reed. John Philip Reed, who died just a couple years ago, was a legal scholar who wrote a 4-volume legal history of the American Revolution that is a masterpiece of scholarship. I have some disagreements with Reed, but it's astounding how brilliant his work was, and that he could write a book of such incredible depth before all these internet resources. It boggles the mind. So I benefited, as the old saying has it, by standing on the shoulders of giants.
Oh, absolutely. And we were especially lucky in the Adams Memorial, as you know, the Adams Papers, which is housed by, the Massachusetts Historical Society, is all available online, and you can search it by date, by, who it's to, who it's from, by a phrase. And so the ability to pull quotes and to pull information is really astounding.
Yeah.
And I would suggest to anyone who has not gone, because they also have it in the original writing. So not only do you have the words, but you also have the writing that and from their hand, which is really, I think, so special to have that.
Assuming you can read it. I mean, we're talking about John Quincy. There's no way you're going to read his handwriting.
Let's hope the translation is correct, right?
Right.
I assume it is. I assume it is. Okay, so a little bit about the book itself. So you talk about the economic factors, so the main drivers of change for the revolution, and then you also talk about the hardships, the abuses the Americans suffered under Britain. Obviously, you talked about some of those a minute ago, but you also talk about the value of ideas and ideology for driving change. So how do you balance these two factors, and how did they play off of each other?
Oh yeah, so in fact, I think that ideas are the driver of change here, and I think, of course, ideas are generated in their context because of their times. There's reasons why people start asking certain questions because of the challenges they're facing, and then they come up with answers, and those set the context for the next generation, and so forth. So it's a dynamic process. I definitely am not one of those historians who thinks that economic forces alone drive history, the sort of Charles Beard thesis. I think that's really nonsense and very obsolete today. But it is true that economics had a lot to do with the revolution. The British mercantilism exploited the colonists for the benefit of the mother country economically in a number of ways that we don't know about today. I mean, the Americans typically aren't taught. For example, one of my favorite examples, the Hat Act, which was a statute that said that if you were an American farmer and you shot a fox on your land and you wanted to make a hat out of that fox's fur, you were not allowed to. You were required to ship the pelt to England to be made into a hat and sent back to you. Similarly, the Iron Act made it illegal to manufacture retail goods out of iron in the colonies. You had to ship the iron from America to Britain to be made into horseshoes or nails or whatever, and then shipped back. Now, this stuff is tripling maybe the cost of living in the colonies, and it's all for the benefit of, as Jefferson said, not men but machines in the island of Great Britain. And what he meant by that was political machines, right? It's lobbying groups who have managed to get Parliament to pass these kinds of trade restrictions in order to benefit the political insiders. It's monopolistic practices, which of course we have just as much today in the form of licensing laws and other economic restrictions that make it largely illegal for a lot of people to earn a living, which they have a constitutional right to do. And so I wanted to emphasize the importance of economic liberty as a driving cause of the revolution. This is something that is often neglected by historians for political reasons, frankly. And I think Jefferson, for example, is not given the kind of credit he deserves for being a champion of laissez-faire. A lot of people say, "Oh, Jefferson, he was an agrarian and he didn't like factories." And it's true, he didn't like factories, but he was an outspoken, in fact, a leading champion of laissez-faire, who insisted, sometimes when his colleagues didn't really want to, on what he called the importance of a free trade with all the world. So Jefferson was a free trade guy, and he emphasizes this time and time again. even more than John Adams does, even though Adams is from the industrial North, right? So I wanted to emphasize the significance of economic liberty, the right to earn a living, as one of the fundamental rights for which the revolution was fought.
Absolutely. And one of the things he talked about, which I think many people also forget, because it's not really taught or talked about, is in the process of overlaying those laws on top of the colonies, that some of it happened, is to your point, like if you were to shoot a fox and you had to ship it over to England and you're going to ship it back and then you're going to wear it, is they simply just ignored it. Like,
Yes.
like, so talk a little, like how much you think. I mean, obviously we don't know how much that was because they didn't track it, right? So we don't know what percentage that was. But I think in a large part of ways, if there were so many laws that couldn't be enforced, that didn't make any sense, and you were told by someone overseas that you were supposed to do it, or someone in the big city that was going to check on you, basically what happens is you totally ignored it. And then talk a little bit about that, and then also how that ties back to the English tradition of things that are kind of codified over time, right?
Yeah.
Versus, yeah. So I think that's a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, well, so the proper response to government intrusion in your life is not obedience but defiance, and that's at least a very Jeffersonian notion. As Jefferson said, the spirit of opposition to government is so important on some occasions that I wish to see it always kept alive. And so, yes, in the colonial America, smuggling and defying British trade restrictions became so commonplace that it really lost the sense that it was even illegal. In fact, I mentioned in the book a couple occasions on which smugglers were arrested, and then the colonial legislature would pass a resolution condemning the officer who arrested the smuggler, because smuggling was so important as part of the American economy. And honestly, who's going to catch you, right? In 1765, if you're smuggling molasses through the swamps of South Carolina, I mean, you're not going to get caught. So it was a very lucrative thing to do, but it also was just not considered wrong. And what happened was, beginning in the 1760s, when Britain started cracking down and actually enforcing these restrictions, then it became a matter of urgent importance to the Americans, and that was a real problem. And that falls into what you said about the way that British law at the time was understood through long practice. So in the book, I say that the revolution began as a legal argument that later became a philosophical argument, because the legal argument failed to resolve the issue, right? The legal argument was between two different ways of viewing the English and later British Constitution. It's an unwritten constitution, so how do you interpret it? You don't go to get a dictionary like we do in America with our written constitution. Instead, you look into history and practice and tradition and things like, old documents like Magna Carta and stuff like that, right? And that theory is called prescriptive right. It's the idea that you can develop law or individual rights through long-standing practice and tradition over a long period of time. On the other side of the spectrum is the legal theory called parliamentary supremacy. And that's the idea that Parliament has supreme absolute power to do anything it wants to. And this was championed by people like William Blackstone, the famous legal thinker, or Lord Mansfield, the Chief Justice of England at the time, who argued that because Parliament had successfully changed the king in 1689, it threw King James off the throne and replaced him with William and Mary. If they could do that, then Parliament can do anything. So Parliament essentially is the Constitution of Great Britain, according to this theory, and everything is subordinate to it, including the king and, of course, the colonial legislatures. So there you have two completely incompatible theories of the Constitution, every bit as incompatible as the pro-slavery and anti-slavery theories of the Constitution a century later. You have the theory that, well, my rights have developed over time through history and practice, and Parliament must respect those rights. And on the other hand, you have the idea that tradition and practice doesn't count for anything, because Parliament can do anything it wants to at any time, and it can repeal Magna Carta if it felt like it, right? And that debate goes on for a decade in the American colonies, right? Until finally it becomes obvious that they're not getting anywhere, and the only path left to them is, as the Americans put it, to acquiesce in the necessity of independence. The Americans say, we're not choosing this path. We've been forced into this path because Parliament and the King refuse to respect our rights. And of course, the King and Parliament respond, well, your rights are just whatever we say they are.
Exactly. But I do feel many they tried so hard in so many ways, to your point, to have their views known, to make sure that they were heard, to understand how they could work together. And in the end, I do believe it became very much a personal belief that the only way they could survive, and Americans are, I mean, got to remember the people that came to America, that came here, they came here on purpose, right? They came here to the new world, so they would choose risk. They would choose to do things that weren't the same. And so here you have a people that have chosen to be in this new world and are riskier, being told to go back and give allegiance and do whatever Parliament tells them to do.
Yeah,
And
and that was a point that was made time and again at the time because it was popular in Britain in the 1760s and 70s to say, well, we chose to create the American colonies. Parliament, out of its magnanimity, authorized the creation of the American colonies. And the Americans were like, nuts to that. First of all, the colonial charters were issued by the king, not by Parliament. Parliament had no authority over us. And secondly, we fled from England. We chose to come here to get away from you. We didn't come here as some sort of exercise of magnanimity on your part.
absolutely. And so to your point, like you wonder how that obviously you have this genetic pool, right? People that chose to be there and chose to take the risk. And then they decided they needed their freedom. So let's talk a little bit about Adams and Jefferson. Obviously, they shared many core values, but they also differed substantially, especially as you mentioned in the later years. So talk a little bit about their similarities and their differences, and then how did it really show up in terms of the Declaration? And we won't have to go into their presidencies, but how it also formed throughout, right, the forming of our country.
Yeah, they are in some ways very similar. They're both classically trained lawyers. They both are, as comfortable reading Latin and Greek as they are reading English or French, and they both are conversant in the great ideas of the Roman and Greek philosophers and the ideas of John Locke and the poetry of John Milton. Supremely educated gentlemen. On the other hand, they're very, very different people in some other ways, right? Even physically. Jefferson is tall and slender, and Adams is short and rotund. And their argument styles are different, their writing styles are different. And what I think, and I put this in the book, I think that one of the really revealing things is Adams is kind of an East Coast personality. I don't mean that to be insulting to my East Coast friends. What I mean by that is that I'm from California and I live in Arizona now, and I notice that the East Coast mentality tends to be more concerned with things like order and the issues of law and rules and maintaining the rule of law, right? And the principles that are necessary for political and economic stability. Whereas in the West, there tends to be a tone that's more relaxed about formalities and tends to prioritize individual freedom over regulation and restriction. And on this point, by the way, I should say, except for California. But anyway, there's this sort of East Coast Western mentality, and I think there's that dynamic going on with Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson was born on what was then the westernmost frontier of the British Empire in Virginia, which he's growing up seeing Indians passing on their way to the colonial capital in Williamsburg. His father was basically a pioneer. And so Jefferson has that Western mentality, and Adams has this idea about economic success and the stability of society and the principles of, religion and politics and how they relate, all the concerns that motivate you in a city environment. And Jefferson, of course, famously said that he disliked cities. Well, you put those two things together, and like I said, they're yin and yang, right? They reinforce each other's strengths tremendously. You have the concern that what Britain is doing in America is undermining the rule of law. And at the same time, it's making it impossible for immigrants to arrive, right? You have both the Western and Eastern ideas combining in the Declaration, and I think it really expresses the American mind very strongly because of that. Now, of course, what happened later on was they divided primarily over the French Revolution, the response to the French Revolution. And I think the reason why is because Adams puts a lot more emphasis on the social foundations of liberty. Adams thinks that liberty is something that comes after a period of social development. And you had 150 years in America of the colonists basically living by themselves and developing the culture of liberty before they have political freedom. Whereas Jefferson, he says, well, if you give people political freedom, the culture will follow. And so when the French Revolution comes along and you have what is essentially a social as well as a political revolution, they look at it very differently. Adams is very pessimistic about it. He's like, these people do not have the cultural foundations necessary for economic and political liberty or religious liberty or voting or any of that stuff, right? They've been living for centuries under a feudal absolute monarchy. And Jefferson says if you take your foot off their necks, they will figure out how to do it. And that's, two legitimate ways of viewing that revolution that are very much in conflict. And that's really what begins the process of destroying their friendship, at least temporarily.
Yeah, and they eventually did come back and become friends through letter writing. But let's talk about, see, you talked earlier about you've always been a Jefferson guy, like you've loved Jefferson. So obviously he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So you start with him. And then you added Adams and you talked about the need to add, but how did you choose Adams? Why Adams?
Well, they just, I like to say it's a buddy picture. They're like the two cops in a Jackie Chan movie. And Adams was a very close friend of Jefferson, but also kind of a mentor at that time because Jefferson was so young. And Adams had grown up with the Revolution, right? He had seen from the very first sparks when the governor of Massachusetts hangs portraits of the Stuart kings in the Supreme Court building in Boston. The Stuart monarchs being legendarily tyrants who had been thrown off the throne in the revolutions in England. And Adams is like, maybe we shouldn't be putting up their portraits, right? And that begins kind of this process toward the revolution. So I thought that was a good starting point. But of course, I also wanted to talk about the philosophical backgrounds too. So I sort of begin with their biographies and then sort of do a flashback to why they came to the ideas that they were brought up on about political liberty, where these things came from. And then Jefferson, of course, comes in to the picture really after the Stamp Act crisis and beginning in the 1770s. And he kind of has to learn from scratch too, right? He had been through college, he had read John Locke and stuff like that, but it had never really struck home until after he's part of the movement. And then he goes back and rereads John Locke and the other writers of political philosophy, and that really forms his foundation, his political foundation.
So when you said went back and reread, it reminded me. I mentioned this to you earlier, but you obviously cover so much ground in this book. And is it being used anywhere as part of the curriculum for classes? I mean, it would be a great, right? I mean, because you cover so much territory and go into so much depth, and it's relatively compared to some of the other things we've read, relatively easy to read. It would be a great book for people to really focus on.
Well, your lips to God's ears. I think that would be wonderful if that happened. I did want one reason why I wrote the book is there's a lot of stuff that is left out of the histories that I have read over the many years that I thought if there were a book on the subject I wish had been included. And so I wanted to kind of write the book that I wish had been around when I was studying the American Revolution in terms of political philosophy and the legal issues and the political issues that led to the revolution. I mean, I don't talk much about the military aspect of the revolution. That's been covered by a lot of wonderful books. And there's tons of great. I don't mean to sound like there aren't a lot of fantastic books out there about the revolution that I benefited from tremendously.
Absolutely. But you do a great job, like I mentioned earlier. I mean, you do a great job of looking back at not just the history of the colonies, but also British history, which obviously informed what we believed in our belief system to really tie it all together to lead to, to the revolution, our own revolutions. I thought it was very interesting. So you mentioned doing this, but you go through and you do a line by line analysis, right, of the Declaration of Independence. I think it's great. I love it, and I think everyone, even if you just pick up that portion of the book and read it, it's worth that to go through that. But what drove you to include this, and how did you go about writing it? I mean, I think that's a great way to do it.
Yeah, well, it was a little bit of a challenge. I had done some of the background stuff, and then I decided I wanted to include this portion, this chapter where I go through the Declaration. I took the text, broke it out into pieces, and then wrote responses to it to explain things. And then from that helped me to know what I would have to build up to and sort of go back to earlier in the book and insert there so that the reader is prepared for it, getting to it later. For a good example of this, actually, and it concerns John Adams particularly, and that is there's a clause in the Declaration that complains about the royal governors moving the legislatures from place to place. That made it difficult for the colonial legislators, to access their public records. And it says that the only reason the governors are doing this is to fatigue us into compliance with their measures. And some scholars, for example, Pauline Maier, in her book American Scripture, kind of make light of this and say, well, this seems like a trivial complaint, because what Adams was thinking of was Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts moved the Massachusetts legislature from Boston to Cambridge, and that's only 3 or 4 miles away, and what's the big deal? Well, what that ignores is that, in fact, several governors did this with their colonial legislatures, most infamously South Carolina, where Governor Montague of South Carolina forced the colonial legislature to meet in all sorts of inconvenient places and move them around expressly in order to fatigue them into compliance with his measures. So much so that he actually got reprimanded and ultimately fired by the British government for doing this, right? So it's not a trivial thing at all. And it wasn't a trivial thing in Massachusetts. It's a matter of principle. You know, if the governor can control the legislature that way, then how is the legislature even worth its salt, right? And so I talk about the things that led up to that in earlier chapters, and then when I get to the Declaration chapter, I explain why that provision is in the Declaration of Independence to begin with. Now, there are some provisions in the Declaration that were kind of put in sort of almost by accident. And specifically, there's a new book that just came out a while back called Rogues and Tyrants that goes through the Declaration and talks about how some things ended up in there. And the complaint about impressment of sailors apparently ended up in the Declaration simply because it happened to be in the newspapers in Philadelphia at the time Jefferson was working on the draft. Now, impressment of sailors was something Americans have been complaining about for decades, right? This is the Royal Navy coming on shore and just grabbing people and dragging them onto ships and saying, now you're a sailor in the Royal Navy, like it or not, right? Impressment was a real problem for many decades before the Revolution. But apparently the reason it ended up in the Declaration is because there was an incident where a Virginia sailor was forced to serve on a British ship, and that was in the newspaper that Jefferson read while he was working on the Declaration of Independence.
Wow, and who says that news isn't instantaneous back then, right?
Right.
Not quite a tweet, but almost, right? He read about it and put it in. And I was surprised. I think you mentioned that. I may have this number wrong, but correct me. But I was surprised at how I knew that had happened. I didn't realize how often that had happened. And I think the number you had was like 250,000. Like there was a huge number of people that happened to.
Yeah, there's a whole book that was just fairly recently published called The Fatal Necessity, which is a history of impressment by the British military. When I was in school, we learned about impressment leading up to the War of 1812, that this was a problem that led to 1812. And it's true that that was one of the causes of that war. But in fact, it had gone on for many, many years before that, and it was of dubious legality even then. And Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson had all complained about it for many years. As I mentioned, John Adams even defended an American sailor who was captured by the British or attempted to be captured. A Royal Navy sailor came on board his ship to try and impress him into the Royal Navy, and he killed the Royal Navy sailor with a harpoon in self-defense, or at least John Adams argued that it was self-defense, and won that case ultimately.
Which you would imagine, but it was, I mean, and it would be horrifying to worry about, if your son or your husband or whoever was going right, and they were sick. Would they come back, or would they be grabbed?
They'd never be seen again, right? They would vanish. And something like 75% of sailors who were impressed into the Navy died during the first 2 years of service, right? So
that was the other thing that I really remember that was like really top of mind. Like that is a very large number that almost, majority of them, way over the majority, wouldn't last 2 years. So there was certainly a death sentence to get captured and taken away. Okay, so you talk obviously about slavery, and you note specifically how unique the founders' candor about the evils, right? That they knew this was an evil institution. So talk a little bit to our audience, talk a little bit about how that unfolded in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And then you mentioned also in your book, John Quincy Adams. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your perspective on John Quincy Adams.
Well, I will take any opportunity to talk about John Quincy Adams because he's one of my great heroes. But before doing that, I'll say there's this mythology, very popular nowadays, that the American Revolution was somehow fought to defend slavery against interference by the British. And that's just nonsense. I mean, the British government was in no sense committed to anti-slavery in the 1770s. And there's this famous Dunmore Proclamation where Governor Dunmore of Virginia promised to liberate those slaves who joined his forces. Some historians have called that an emancipation proclamation, and that's completely false. For one thing, it only applied to the slaves of rebels, not to the slaves of loyalists, and the British military happily returned the slaves of loyalists back to their masters if they fled. And it only applied to those slaves who were willing and able to bear arms, so it didn't apply to women or children or the elderly or anything like that. In fact, what's amazing about the American Revolutionary Fathers is how candid they were about the fact that slavery was inconsistent with the revolution. I don't know of any parallel to this in world history, where the leaders of a revolution say, oh, by the way, it turns out that the very foundation of our entire economy is something contrary to what we're fighting for, and therefore we have to put it to an end at some point. That's amazing, right? And that's what they did. The very first anti-slavery society in the world was founded in Philadelphia in 1775 during the war. And of course, Jefferson famously wrote this lengthy paragraph attacking slavery in his initial draft of the Declaration. His original plan was that the Declaration would like build up to this climax. It starts with these relatively minor complaints about the king's not signing our laws, and it builds up step by step to this impassioned paragraph, this full paragraph denouncing slavery and denouncing the king for participating in slavery. And he's a Christian, but he behaves in a way that would embarrass barbarians and all this sort of stuff, you know. And of course, it ended up being struck out at the insistence of some states that practiced slavery and some other states that engaged in the slave trade. And Jefferson was so disappointed by this that he wrote out copies of his original draft and sent them to friends with letters that said things like, don't you think my original was better, right? And he did the same thing 50 years later in his autobiography. There can be no denying that the American Founding Fathers considered slavery to be evil and inconsistent with their principles. Of course they believed that all men are created equal. The only, the only legal authority I know of that stands for the proposition that the American Founding Fathers did not believe that all men in the Declaration refers to all men is the Dred Scott case. That is what the Dred Scott case in fact held, was that the founders did not believe all men to be all men. And as Abraham Lincoln pointed out in his speech denouncing Dred Scott, there's only one piece of evidence for that. Only one. And that is that the American founders did not immediately free all the slaves on July 4th, 1776. But that's not good evidence for that point, because there's all sorts of reasons why they didn't do that. For example, they had no authority to do that. And if they had tried to do that, nobody would have listened to them, and the Continental Congress would have fallen apart, and the revolution would have failed. So it would have been a futile gesture, and it would have been self-defeating to try to do that. So none of this proves that all men doesn't include all men. And yet nowadays, that's considered a respectable view, and that it's just historically and philosophically asinine.
Yes.
Now, the great champion of anti-slavery thought after the deaths of the revolutionary generation is John Quincy Adams, right? John Quincy Adams, a literal son of the Revolution, returns to Congress in the 1830s, and he is the godfather of the idea that the Constitution is a fundamentally anti-slavery document. He's a mentor to people like Charles Sumner and the other anti-slavery thinkers. William Seward, who is Lincoln's Secretary of State, writes the first biography of John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy is the single most important voice for the idea that the Declaration of Independence sets the framework for the proper understanding of the Constitution, and in doing so, puts slavery on, in Lincoln's words, the course of ultimate extinction. So I absolutely admire John Quincy tremendously, and I wanted to make sure to book as a key figure as movement that led to the Civil War. And I think only in recent years has John Quincy really started to get the respect that he deserves as such a heroic figure for his fight during that, decade or 15 years or however long it was that he was serving in the House of Representatives.
It's amazing. So two follow-up questions. One, I'm going to go back to your discussion about the colonies when we're not, then I'll come to John Quincy. But, to your point about people looking backwards and believing this, that, and they're obvious that we were 13, all 13. It all part of the journey was that all three of the colonies were all moving together, and I believe that while they believed it was not right, that it should not be there. They also knew that that would break the entire deal.
Right. Right. Yeah.
They,
Colonial union was absolutely the most from the revolutionary cause, then the whole thing would come crashing down around them. And so, unfortunately, that meant that if a single colony had some stupid objection, then they kind of had to go with it, And this is a point that John himself complains about a number of times. But he again had to know, or knew that it had to be that way. So, yeah,
13 totally different colonies. I mean,
13 clocks ringing at the same time, as they say.
yeah, I mean, unbelievable. And then back to John Quincy Adams, I think he's to me the most interesting, just because if you're John Quincy, you're born a British subject in the United States, right, in the colonies. You then, your father goes off and serves. You and your mother stand and watch the Battle of Bunker Hill together, and you see that happening. And then you go overseas with your father. You're ending up serving overseas in a variety of posts. Your Secretary of State, you off the Monroe Doctrine, you become the president and then the vice president, and then you literally serve with Abraham Lincoln in the House of Representatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, so to think of his lifespan, and Abraham Lincoln was one of his honorary pallbearers at his funeral.
Yeah.
And so to think of his lifespan of before we declared our independence, right? All the way through and up to, not all the way to the Civil War, but in my mind, I often think of him as, because exactly as you said, he was so anti-slavery. He talked about it all the time. Speaker Johnson gives a great quote about, when a young congressman asked him when he was in Congress, which his family did not want him to do because what a demotion, right? You're president, and now you're in the Congress. But asked him one day, Mr. President, why do you keep putting up all these anti-slavery motions? They're not going to, they're not going to pass. Like, it's futile. Nothing's going to happen. And John Quincy Adams said, duty is ours, results are God's. So he felt very compelled to fight against slavery. And I think in many ways, he set us up, he set the nation up to be able to endure the Civil War.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, on this subject, I've been recommending a number of books, but I'll do it again. And that is, I cannot strongly enough urge people to read the absolute masterpiece, Arguing About Slavery by William Lee Miller, one of my favorite books of all time, that is about John Quincy Adams's decade-long fight against the gag rule, which was the rule in Congress that prohibited the introduction of petitions against slavery. Now, John Quincy Adams would do this anyway. He would introduce these petitions that asked for the abolition of slavery, and he would say, I myself am not saying that slavery should be ended, but my constituents have the right to petition, and they have a right to say what they want. And the congressmen just hated this, and they're bang the gavel and everything like this. And this went on for a decade of John Quincy fighting for the right to petition, because that, of course, gave him a convenient excuse to talk about the evils of slavery. And the more that the Southern congressmen tried to shut him up, the more opportunities he had to speak about the evils of slavery. So he had them really in a wonderful little trap, and he exploited it. One anecdote of that is that because his speeches got reprinted in the newspapers, his tirades against slavery got a lot of wide circulation. And in the 1830s and 40s, there was a young boy in Baltimore who was illiterate and was learning to read by collecting scraps of newspaper that he found in the gutters of the city. And what he found were John Quincy Adams's speeches against slavery. And his eyes were opened by these speeches, and he came to love them, and they helped him to learn to read. And that was Frederick Douglass, who, as a young boy in Baltimore, helped fool. The way he learned to read was by fooling the white boys of the neighborhood into teaching him how to read. And he would grab these little scraps of paper, and he would buy books if he could afford them. And he mentions in his memoirs that he would get John Quincy Adams' speeches in newspapers that people had thrown away and read them. So John Quincy Adams inspired a great many important people with his tirades against slavery. There's one incident, by the way, I got to tell this story too. So John Quincy, he gets up at one point and he proposes, he says, Mr. Speaker, is it in order to introduce a petition signed by slaves? And this outrageous, oh my goodness, how dare he, and banging the gavel, and he's in trouble and everything like this. And this goes on all day. And finally, when it's over, John Quincy gets up and he says, I didn't introduce the petition. I just asked whether it was in order to do so. What are you talking about? It was that kind of sort of clever political debate tactics that just ground the pro-slavery representatives into the ground over and over again. Now, he's a marvelous figure and a very dramatic story, and There's of course the marvelous Steven Spielberg film Amistad
Mhm.
that tells of
Right.
John Quincy's work on behalf of the Amistad slaves, but it doesn't talk about the petition crisis. And to my mind, the petition story is every bit as dramatic. And I think if anybody out there, if anybody in Hollywood land is listening in on this conversation, please make a movie about John Quincy Adams' fight for the right of petition.
I would love to see a John Quincy Adams movie, and and you. It sounds like I don't know what's in your future writing wise, but it sounds like you might have a JQA book in you.
Maybe, although, it's very fortunate that there have been a large number of good John Quincy Adams books in just the past few years, a number of really solid biographies, and the Library of America just published a wonderful 2-volume set that includes his diaries and his speeches and pamphlets. He would also write lengthy pamphlets about the Constitution and the Declaration, just a treasure trove of information there. So very much worth people's time.
Well, we'll see what you have next. Okay, as you know, we are in the process of building a memorial. So by law, the commission it's for Abigail and John Adams, Louisa Catherine, John Quincy, Henry and Charles. So it's for the Adams family for the 4 generations, which has never been done before, right? We don't have family in DC. We don't have family memorials. I think it's very fitting. Abigail clearly had a huge impact. She was an entrepreneur. I mean, we've had authors on to talk about Abigail Adams. She was just way ahead of her time. The
In my
cabinet.
opinion, the greatest woman in American history.
Well,
Present
thank
company
you.
accepted, of course.
Nah, you're funny, but I believe you're right. But she really, and she so anchored her husband. I do believe that without Abigail Adams, John Adams would not have been John Adams. Right? He
Oh yeah,
could,
no question.
yeah, he could not have fulfilled that role if she was
Yeah.
not. So she was hugely important. John Quincy Adams, we just talked about how important he was. So here's a question for you: as we're thinking about, we're still early on in the process, and we've talked to lots of different people, and we're beginning to think about what should we, because if we do our job right, it's not just a place to go, but it's something to experience, right? And hopefully, when people leave that place, they're inspired. Now, I personally hope they're inspired by a family who is faithful and dedicated and sacrificed so much, and what that meant to our nation, and then what they can do in return. Like, what does that mean for you? Like, how can you, right? And Abigail, who lived back when women really didn't have, really weren't involved in public life, had a huge impact. So how can you have a huge impact? But I'm curious, like, what would you want people to think about? What should we include, or what should they take away from the memorial? If you were like, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, so it's a little difficult, but what to you is like maybe most inspirational about the Adams family?
Well, you know, it's too much to ask anyone to devote themselves to a political cause as much as the Adamses did. You used the word sacrifice earlier, and it is true, especially John Quincy sacrificed a great deal of their personal happiness for the freedom of the country. And as much as one can admire that, one also cannot reasonably ask people to devote that much of their lives because they have other things to worry about. They have families to care for. John and John Quincy, for as great Americans as they were not always the best husbands or the best fathers. There's an old poem by Yeats where he says that we must choose between the perfection of the work or the life. And both John and John Quincy chose the perfection of the work. And as a result, their lives suffered in some ways. So I would never ask my fellow Americans or anybody to give as much as the Adams family did. However, at the same time, I think we all do have an obligation to give at least something, right? And I think what John and John Quincy and Abigail stand for is a family that's, they're not ordinary, but they're not aristocrats. They're
Hmm.
not super rich. They're, in fact, even among the Adams family, they're kind of the neglected branch, right? Sam is the really famous one early on, and John is sort of the country cousin. And
Right.
it was through hard work and discipline and devotion to the cause that they were willing time and time and time again to prioritize the freedom of their country over other concerns. And we are very fortunate that we don't live, at least not right now, in a moment of crisis that requires an equal effort on our part. And John himself anticipated that, right? He had that famous line where he says, I must study war so that my son can study statesmanship, so that my grandson can study art, and we are very fortunate that we're in that position. We're in the grandson or the great grandson's position. So we aren't called upon to make as strong an effort as they were, but we nevertheless have evil around us, and we have unfreedom around us, and we have miles to go before we sleep. And so that would be the message that I would think a John Adams or a John Quincy Adams memorial should give is we're not asking of you that you devote as much as these guys did, but devote a little something because, if nothing else, in their honor to say thank you to them.
And I love the way you put it because I've had this discussion with a friend of mine who's also involved in this project because they left an extraordinary legacy, right? So no one would ever say that they're not, they didn't just do a few things and go away. You know, John Adams served on 80 different committees, and
Yeah.
John Quincy, gave his entire life to his country. Beginning he was a very small boy, so they gave so much to our country. So I'd never say they didn't give a lot or sacrifice, but they were, to your point, or we just said this, they were ordinary people.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they weren't George Washington with a huge estate. They weren't Thomas
Right.
Jefferson with a lot of money. They weren't, they didn't come from a huge family with aristocracy. And they were just, he was a guy who, his parents wanted to become a, clergyman, and he thought he might become a teacher. He eventually became a lawyer. Like he worked
Yeah.
incredibly hard, and they made a huge difference, but they were just people. And I
Yeah.
think
He
that
writes
is
this
so
letter later
great.
in life. He writes a letter to Jefferson where he says, if I could have worked my will, I would have been a mathematician.
Exactly. So I mean, they're just ordinary people, but they did extraordinary things because they did it with faith, they did it with devotion, and I think that's something people can take away. That even though, I mean, you're an ordinary person, you can still do something, and it could be something small, and it could be something small as Abigail was known for tending to the community around her and making sure
Yeah.
that people had things as they needed them. I mean, that's a great way to honor them. But there's so many different things that they did. The challenge is going to be figuring out how to put all of that the breadth, right, the years, and also the depth of what they did into memorial.
And on that point, John Quincy, when he was elected to Congress, I think he was pretty open about the fact that he was so proud of that. He was prouder of that than he was of the presidency because in serving in Congress, it was the only time he had ever been chosen for a public office by the vote of his neighbors. His neighbors voted for him and asked him to serve. That had not happened. Of course, the presidency wasn't chosen that way at that time, and
Right.
none of his diplomatic appointments or anything. So serving in that office and representing his community made him so much prouder than those other things because it was sort of a symbol to him that he had done right by his country. That mattered a lot to him. So I admire that immensely.
I love that, and we're going to close out with that. But I love the fact that he really focused on while he was in the representatives of what it meant to his community, and I think Abigail certainly had a lot of that
Yeah.
in terms of where she focused her time and her effort to make sure her community was as good as it could be.
Any
We
woman who melts down her children's toys to make musket balls for the Americans to shoot at the redcoats is a friend of mine.
Oh my gosh, she really is. I mean, she's amazing. I can't wait to. Do you have another project coming up yet, or not yet? Another book?
I have some ideas, but
Okay.
it's bad luck to talk about a book
I
until
know.
it's finished.
I know.
So,
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, just so you know, if Adams is at the end of the name, we'd love to have you back.
all right.
You've obviously done a lot of research here. It's a great book. I hope everyone goes out and buys it and gives it as Christmas gifts. Right? It's coming, so that would be great. But thank you, Tim, so much for being on with us
Thank
tonight.
you.
I'm so appreciative, and for everyone that's on, thank you for joining us. For those that watch later, thank you for joining us, and please visit theadamsmemorial.org. Thank you so much. Have a great night.